third presenter is Professor James Riddlesperger, who is Professor of Political Science at Texas Christian University. He received his PhD from the University of Missouri-Columbia and is truly an expert on congressional leadership, especially from the great state of Texas. And his most recent publications is a book on reflections on Rayburn, and he is speaking, in fact, on Sam Rayburn, cornerstone of the Austin-Boston connection.
Well, thank you so much. Delighted to be here. I think it says a lot about Sam Rayburn that I could make the argument that neither Social Security nor the draft of 1940 would have happened had not been for Sam Rayburn's leadership in ushering them through the House of Representatives from his position as the chair of the Interstate Foreign Commerce Commission committee when he was in 1935, and then in 1940 as the primary supporter in Congress of President Roosevelt. And so while it was not in his nature to be a cause person, he wouldn't have drafted the Social Security Act. He wouldn't have drafted the draft act, but he was the person who knew how to manage them through the House of Representatives. And that is really, in many ways, I mean, I could give you 300 examples of that. In many ways, that explains both why I think Rayburn is not given his due as a leader, because he wasn't the guy who was out there on the front lines making impassioned arguments in favor of this, that, or the other. He was, in fact, the person working behind the scenes to try to manage things through the House of Representatives. And he worked on the draft particularly. He enlisted his young protege, Lyndon Johnson. And it was one of Johnson's very early tests as a master legislator to line up support for the passage of the 1940 Draft Act. So, in a way, this is a perfect prelude to my discussion of Sam Rayburn. I would make the argument, and I've had debates with people about it before, I'd make the argument that if we talk about the greatest legislators in American history, we should start with the number 2, because the number 1 position has been taken. Sam Rayburn ran the House of Representatives from 1937, when he was elected as majority leader, until his death in 1961. There was the brief interlude in the 46 election that Max mentioned, when the Republicans took control, and then another brief interlude in 52 when they took control for 2 years. But even then, Rayburn worked well with the Speaker of the House, Joe Martin, who was one of his closest friends in Congress, a Republican from Massachusetts. In 1954, when the Democratic Campaign Committee was trying to take back the House, they tried to get Sam Rayburn to go to Boston to campaign against Joe Martin for re-election, with the hopes that Rayburn could then again become Speaker of the House instead of Minority Leader, which is a huge difference, obviously, in politics. Rayburn refused, saying, I believe if I lived in that district, I might very well vote for Joe Martin, and I will not campaign against him. Again, what a difference from the way we think about politics today. Rayburn, of course, goes from the 1930s in both directions. He was elected to Congress in 1912, began his service in 1913, served 48 years in the House of Representatives, and died in office in 1961. He used to say, I was a gnat's hair away from being a dirt farmer for the rest of my life. He was a man that was born in poverty in Tennessee. His family moved to Bonham, Texas. If you've ever been to Bonham, Texas, you would appreciate the irony of this, for better opportunities from what they had in Tennessee. He worked his way through East Texas Normal College, which is now Texas A&M Commerce. Was elected and was inspired early on by Joseph Weldon Bailey, who is a name that's largely forgotten now, but was one of the great dynamos in congressional history, also probably one of the most corrupt men in congressional history. But Bailey was a great orator. Democrats said that the Democrats who saw both of them said that he was a far more compelling speaker than William Jennings Bryan ever hoped to be, which of course is contrary to what we now know. Bailey's largely forgotten because he was such a character in not an endearing way that people tried to forget his presence. But it was his speaking that inspired Rayburn into a career in politics. And then it was Rayburn's support of Bailey and his support by John Nance Garner that they used to give him a congressional district after the redistricting of 1910, after the census of 1910, and a district that he could win in. So he was elected in 12 and served until his death. I would argue that if we want to talk about Rayburn's influence, and there are some wonderful biographies of Rayburn. The best of them is the Hardeman and Bacon biography. If you ever want a kind of blow-by-blow description, it's fun. Hardeman was for many years his chief assistant, and Bacon was a journalist who finished the book when Hardeman died. But it's a wonderful little biography if you're interested in it. So I'm not going to try to go through all of those issues. But what I do want to do is talk about Rayburn's impact. His impact was first and foremost as a representative of his cherished 4th District of Texas, the district in northeast Texas, just south of the Red River, and running through most of the eastern half of the state. He saw himself as a representative of rural America, and so the Rural Electrification Act was his first, and in his mind, his longest lasting legislative success. He always thought bringing electricity to the farmers of his district and transforming their lives in the process was one of his greatest actions as a leader. And he always said that if you don't keep your mind on the folks back home, you cannot be a good legislator. He was a man with Rayburnisms, and he had no respect for people who wanted to tear things down. He would say any jackass can kick a barn down, but it takes a carpenter to build one. And we, he would say in Congress, are in the carpentry business. And this was something he sincerely believed. He worked with Republicans, he worked with Democrats alike, although he obviously felt more at home with Democrats than Republicans. Having said that, as I've already said, Joe Martin was one of his closest friends in Congress. He succeeded, he was elected majority leader with the explicit backing of Vice President John Nance Garner. He would not have been elected. John O'Connor was a Tammany Hall representative from New York City, of course. O'Connor's brother Basil was Franklin Roosevelt's closest friends, and later the head of the Warm Springs Foundation. But John O'Connor was a Tammany politician. Franklin Roosevelt hated him. He was targeted by Roosevelt in the Purge of 1936, which is, I've always wondered what the O'Connor family dinners must have looked like. But he ran against it, and against Rayburn, and probably had the votes lined up to get elected, were it not for the fact that Vice President Garner got involved in it. There's some great stories about electing Rayburn. One of the great stories, the greatest story of all, is the one about the Louisiana delegation that was all committed to O'Connor's candidacy for the majority leader, and then John Nance Garner went in and met with them, and they came out unanimously backing Sam Rayburn. No one knows what was said in that meeting, but something interesting happened there. And so Rayburn becomes majority leader. William Bankhead, better known as Tallulah's daddy, was the Speaker of the House, but he was so sick on the day that he was elected as Speaker that he couldn't even come to his swearing in, and that was a nice preparation for his nearly 4 years as Speaker. He rarely was healthy enough to come to Congress. And so Rayburn, from the day he's elected majority leader, is de facto the leader of the party. So you're talking about a 24-year era where Rayburn dominates the House of Representatives. He is the middle part of what we call the Austin-Boston connection. That is the connection that helped the Democrats maintain control of the House of Representatives from the election of John Nance Garner as Speaker of the House in 1931 until Jim Wright's demise in 1989. Over that entire period of time, with the exception of 4 years, the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives, and the speakers of the House, with the exception the three in the middle 1930s, Joe Burns of Tennessee, Harold Rainey of Illinois, and William Bankhead of Alabama. All the speakers in that entire era were either from Boston, Massachusetts, or from Texas or Neo-Texas. Carl Albert, of course, is the Neo-Texan. Rayburn used to say that they represented adjoining districts. Rayburn's was south of the Red River, Albert's was north. They would campaign together because when Oklahoma opened up, so many people from Rayburn's district moved into Oklahoma, so their families were literally on both sides of the border. And Rayburn used to say about Albert, he may not be a Texan, but I love the color of the dirt under his fingernails. So why did that happen? Well, the answer is because of race, That was the great divider in the Democratic Party, and so you needed to have moderates on the issue of race. The smallest African-American population in any northern city in the United States was in Boston, Massachusetts. The fights there were between the English and the Irish. How bad were they? As you all know, John Kennedy says, I know what it's like to be black in the United States. I grew up Irish in Boston. It was a silly response, but it was the way that Bostonians understood race issues and reflective of that. And so they were moderates on the issue of race. They were moderates on the issue of integration. And then Texas, and not Deep East Texas. Deep East Texas is properly seen as part of the Deep South. But that rim around East Texas, Bonham in Northeast Texas, Uvalde, of course, in West Texas, which is where John Nance Garner's from, and Fort Worth on the western edge of where the West begins, as we say in Fort Worth, were very low African-American population parts of Texas. The two most moderate regions in the Democratic coalition were Boston and Texas. And that's the reason that they passed leadership back and forth. Who selected Sam Rayburn to be Speaker of the House? John Nance Garner. Who selected John McCormick to be Sam Rayburn's second? Well, it was Mayor Curley of Boston, old Boston politician. Who selected Albert to become a majority leader? It was Rayburn. Who selected Tip O'Neill to be Speaker of the House? Well, it was John McCormick. Who selected Jim Wright to be... You see, they passed it back and forth, and they dominated politics for that whole period of time, and Rayburn's the key. Because Rayburn was the protege of the originator of that and the mentor to the end of that period. He is the cornerstone of Democratic dominance for that period of time. He used informal persuasion. I love talking. I noticed we're having a wonderful paper on the 57 Civil Rights Act. Jim Wright told me one time why he voted for that. He was getting huge amounts of negative mail from his constituents. Rayburn calls him to the well of the House. And he says, Jim, I think you want to vote for this bill. I know you're getting a lot of pushback from your constituents back home. But Rayburn said, Jim, I think you're man enough to do this, and you will never regret your vote. Wright looked at him when he told the story. You say, what was I supposed to say? I'm not man enough? This is Rayburn's way. Rayburn knew how to work things. And Wright said he was dead right. Because if you know, when Jim Wright was elected majority leader, he was accused of being a racist because he had voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. How was he able to persuade his colleagues that he wasn't? Because he had voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1957, the first act passed ever after Reconstruction. And it gave him a credibility that he otherwise would not have had. He only won by one vote. Rayburn had that kind of influence. He had universal respect. He was simply known as Mr. Sam. No one in Washington called him by any other name the last 25 years he was in Congress. He was kind of a stern person. There's a picture of Lyndon Johnson kissing him on his bald head. I've always admired Rayburn's hairstyle. And Jim Wright said Lyndon is the only person who could have gotten away from that with that. But Rayburn was kind of a stern figure. But he was universally respected. The single most remarkable act, I think, of leadership in U.S. history was Rayburn's ability to get the Manhattan Project funded year after year after year. It was a black marked appropriation that was the second or third highest appropriation amount in the entire budget of the United States. Every year Rayburn said, "Trust me, this is an important thing that I can't tell you anything about, but I need your support." And it was passed by Congress without any question, year after year after year, simply on the promise from Sam Rayburn that it was a good use of the resources of the United States. I can't even fathom that kind of respect in Congress today. And yet Rayburn had that level of respect. He had reluctant civil rights leadership. Rayburn himself, his hero was Robert E. Lee. He would tell you that till the day he died. If you go in the bottom, in his library in Bonham today, there's a framed picture of Robert E. Lee. I thought it was the one that was in his speaker's office. He was a lifelong segregationist. And yet, the 57 Civil Rights Act is not passed in the House of Representatives without his assistance. Why? Because, as Rayburn always said, I am a Democrat without prefix, without suffix, and without apology. And it is time for us to move forward. This is something that is another characteristic of Rayburn's leadership. He was not a man of great insight. He was not a man who led cultural revolutions. But he was a man who understood the waves of history, and that if things were going to happen, we might as well make them happen in a positive way rather than in a negative way. He was a cooperative leader. He led a Congress where Democrats worked with Congress across party lines, where leadership in the House worked with the leadership in the Senate, with and across party lines. I will end with just one story. In 1954, when the Democrats won back the House of Representatives, and Joe Martin was going to have to leave his favorite office in Washington, the Speaker's rooms in the Capitol. I don't know if you've ever been in the Speaker's rooms. I had the chance to go there when Jim Wright was Speaker. Oh my God. The view from the Capitol Dome down the mall is just breathtaking. Martin loved that office, and yet he had lost the election. Sam Rayburn went up to the Speaker's office and said, "Joe, you and I are getting too old to move. Why don't I just be Speaker from the minority leader's offices downstairs, and you stay here in the Speaker's office?" A man with universal respect, who knew how to get along. Now, he could be tough as a boot. His favorite term for his opponents was, well, I won't say it out loud. He could be tough as a boot. But at the end of the day, he understood the national interest, and he pursued it with dignity, and he pursued it with all of his colleagues. And it's something that is in such stark contrast with the politics in Washington today that I think we would be well advised to take some of the lessons that Sam Rayburn brought to leadership in the House to heart. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Questions?
Is it not true that Sam Rayburn's little known fact that he was largely responsible for drafting the SEC legislation to start the SEC?
Oh, yeah.
Even though John Foster Dulles and company
Sure.
came down and stopped
Again,
him.
but remember, what Rayburn's role is, he didn't understand what the SEC did. That wouldn't have been what Rayburn did. Rayburn would trust somebody like Galbraith or someone else, say, we really need to do this, and Rayburn would be the one that would figure out how to get that through Congress.
I thought he actually wrote some of it.
He probably, if he did, it was not because of the technical detail. It was because he felt like it was something that could be sold to Congress as part of his legislative strategy. He was a strategic politician, almost entirely. You didn't look to Rayburn to understand the ins and outs of legislation. You looked to Rayburn to figure out a way to get it through the chamber. And that was his entire approach, which is why I think sometimes people don't understand how significant Sam Rayburn was, because you'll never see his name on a bill. You'll never see his fingerprints on the drafting of a bill. You'll never see him being the primary spokesperson for a bill to get it through Congress. Instead, what you see is him calling a member aside one after another, going down to the Board of Education at the end of every day and throwing back a few bourbons and branches and striking a blow for liberty, as they said at the time, and working the congressional offices. Rayburn literally would go down the hall and go in to every member's office down a hall, just to chat, as he would say it. We need to chat. Well, everybody knew what that meant. And if they told him compellingly, I can't vote for this bill, Rayburn would say, well, you know your constituency better than I do. I'll get you next time. But the key is, he remembered next time. And so he had, every time somebody voted against him, they owed him a favor. Rayburn never lost a vote. He won a lot of close votes, but he never lost a vote because of his strategic ability to work things through Congress. So that would be and I don't know the details on the SEC. I just don't know the answer to the question. But I do know the approach.
I think it's interesting you said his name's not on any bill, but his name's on a building.
His name's on a building, sure is.
Yes.
I'd like to ask Professor Ashbaugh a question about the chronology. During early 1917, a number of socialists and wobblies were arrested for opposing the draft bill. Now, I believe the United States declared war in April. Is that right?
That's right.
Well, I'm wondering if the claim that the draft that preceded World War II really is the first peacetime draft because of the number of leftists arrested during the anti-German panic of 1917.
I thought they were all arrested after April. Am I wrong?
I can't say you're wrong. I'm not sure, but I wanted to see if you could clear that up in my mind.
Yeah, you know, I my assumption was, I mean, I teach that period, but I've always assumed that they're arrested when they bring the draft, because the draft doesn't start the war. They don't have enough soldiers to volunteer, and that's why they start the draft in 1917. It probably doesn't even kick in until 1918. That's why we don't even fight, right? Our soldiers don't even fight until March 8, 1918.
Right.
So it's a long time after the
But
war.
there were leftists in jail.
There were leftists in jail.
Early 1917.
Could that have been because of the Espionage Act and the Sabotage Act,
Okay.
rather than that?
That sounds plausible.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Other questions? Well, then we thank our panelists very much.